The sun had just begun to rise over Washington, D.C., painting the city in shades of gold and soft pink. At Ronald Reagan National Airport, the terminals were already alive with the usual early morning rush. Passengers wheeling suitcases, children dragging backpacks, business travelers checking emails on their phones, and airport announcements echoing through the halls. Among all the people moving quickly and noisily, one elderly man walked slowly and quietly, almost invisible to the crowd around him. His name was Arthur Delaney, but most people who knew him well just called him Art. He was 83 years, old and dressed simply. A neat white shirt, gray trousers, and a navy blue blazer. There was nothing flashy about him, nothing loud or demanding. The only thing that stood out was a small silver pin on his lapel, a five-pointed star shining against the fabric of his coat. It was the Silver Star, the third highest military decoration for valor in combat, awarded only to soldiers who had shown gallantry and bravery in the face of enemy fire. Art had never spoken much about the war. Most people in his neighborhood didn't even know he had served, let alone that he had been decorated for heroism. He had been a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War, and his medal came from a mission that very nearly cost him his life. But that was decades ago. These days, he lived a quiet life in San Diego, spending his time reading, walking in the park, and occasionally volunteering at the local VA hospital. He didn't have much family left. His wife had passed away several years ago, and their only son lived abroad. The reason Art was at the airport that morning was simple. He was returning home from a veterans reunion. Every few years, a group of surviving soldiers from his old unit gathered somewhere in the country. This year they had met in D.C. to visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and to pay tribute to the names of friends they had lost. The trip had been emotional. Art had not seen some of the men in over a decade. They had laughed, cried, and shared old stories, some funny, some painful. Now, as he approached the airline check-in counter, he felt a quiet mix of sadness and gratitude. Another reunion had passed, and he was still here. When Art reached the counter, he handed over his ID and ticket confirmation. The young woman behind the desk greeted him with a professional smile, but didn't seem to notice the Silver Star pin. She typed rapidly on her keyboard, then paused, frowning slightly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Delaney," she said, "but there's been a change in your seat assignment. First class is currently full, so you've been moved to economy." Art blinked, but said nothing. He simply nodded. He had been booked in first class through a military appreciation program, but he wasn't upset. He didn't feel entitled to anything special. In his mind, economy or first class, it didn't matter. All that mattered was getting home. "Thank you," he said softly. "That's fine." The woman handed him a new boarding pass and gestured toward the security area. Art thanked her again and walked slowly away, not noticing the two businessmen behind him who were upgraded to the seats he had lost. To them, it was just another business trip. They never even looked at the old man stepping aside to make room. Art's steps were careful and steady as he passed through security. The line was long, and people in a hurry sometimes bumped into him, but he never complained. He held his shoes in one hand and his boarding pass in the other, waiting his turn. A few agents smiled politely, but most were too busy or too tired to notice the quiet veteran among the crowd. By the time Art reached his gate, the area was already full of passengers waiting to board. Some were watching movies on tablets, others were sipping coffee or scrolling through their phones. No one noticed the elderly man with the worn leather briefcase, sitting silently in the corner by the window. He looked out at the plane being prepared on the tarmac, its silver wings catching the morning light. He thought about the flight ahead, the hours in the air, and the familiar view of the Pacific Ocean he would see as the plane descended into San Diego. He thought about the old stories shared over beers just days earlier, about the friend who used to write poems in the trenches, the one who made everyone laugh even in the worst conditions, and the one who never made it back. He thought about the black granite wall they had visited together, where he had placed his hand on a name and whispered a quiet thank you. When the gate agent called for pre-boarding, Art remained seated. He didn't need extra help, though he moved more slowly these days. When his group was called, he stood and walked toward the gate with his boarding pass and ID. No one offered to help. No one noticed the medal on his coat. He handed his documents to the gate agent, who smiled briefly and waved him through. Inside the jet bridge, the air was colder. The hum of the plane's engines grew louder. Art entered the aircraft and stepped into the narrow aisle, holding on to the seatbacks as he walked. First-class passengers were already seated, their seats wide and cushioned, drinks in their hands, headphones over their ears. A flight attendant greeted him politely but without recognition. Art nodded and kept moving toward the back as he passed. Through first class and into the economy cabin, a few passengers looked up, then returned to their devices. A child asked his mother who the grandpa man was, but she hushed him quickly. Art found his seat in row 28, by the window. He placed his briefcase in the overhead bin with some difficulty, then sat down with a tired sigh. The seat was tight, the armrests hard. But he didn't mind. He adjusted the air vent above him and closed his eyes for a moment, just listening to the noises around him. Far ahead in the first-class cabin, seated near the bulkhead, a tall, broad-shouldered man in uniform adjusted his watch. He had sharp eyes and a calm, commanding presence. His name was General Marcus Roth, a four-star general in the United States Army, returning from a high-level security meeting at the Pentagon. He was well known among military ranks and respected by soldiers of all ages. His chest bore numerous ribbons, but he was never one to show off. Like most good leaders, he believed in humility. As General Roth glanced around the cabin, something caught his eye. A flash of silver, a small pin, on the lapel of a man walking by. The general's eyes narrowed as he studied the figure. It was an elderly man, quiet and unassuming, but there was something familiar in the way he walked, something proud in the way he carried himself, even with age slowing him down. Then he saw it clearly. The Silver Star. It wasn't a common medal. You didn't just get a Silver Star. You earned it. And you usually earned it by saving lives or standing your ground in the middle of fire. Roth had read countless citations in his career, and suddenly a name came to mind. Delaney, Lieutenant Arthur Delaney. Vietnam, the jungle ambush, the rescue. He had read that story in a military archive years ago, how Delaney had stayed behind to cover his men, bleeding from a gunshot wound, holding off enemy forces for over an hour until reinforcements arrived. A hero by any standard. Now, here was that man sitting in economy, nearly forgotten. General Roth stared for a long moment, unsure of what he was feeling, a mix of admiration, shame, and frustration. How could a man like that be pushed to the back of a plane while others, many of whom had never served, sipped champagne in luxury seats? He didn't act immediately. Instead, he asked a flight attendant quietly, "Can I ask you something? That gentleman who just walked by, the one with the silver star. What's his name?" The flight attendant checked her list. "Mr. Arthur Delaney," she said. The general nodded slowly. Yes, that was him. Without another word, he stood up and stepped into the aisle, already making a decision that would change the course of this flight, and become a story people would talk about for years to come. The plane was almost ready to leave. Passengers were finding their seats, stuffing carry-on bags into overhead bins, adjusting air vents, and settling in for the long flight from Washington, D.C. to San Diego. Flight attendants moved up and down the narrow aisle, checking seatbelts, smiling politely, reminding people to switch their phones to airplane mode. At the very front of the aircraft, in first class, General Marcus Roth sat calmly, his large frame stretched out in a wide leather seat. He had traveled like this many times before, usually for official missions or government meetings. But this flight felt different. There was something stirring inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't anxiety or fear. It was something deeper, a mixture of pride, sadness, and a strange sense of responsibility that he could not shake off. He couldn't stop thinking about the old man who had passed by just moments earlier, the man with the slow, careful steps, the wrinkled face, and the small silver star pin on his coat. General Roth had recognized the medal instantly. He'd also noticed the humble way the man moved through the plane, not asking for attention, not demanding anything. He just kept walking, past the wide seats of first class, through the quieter business section, and all the way into the crowded rows of economy. Roth had seen that kind of quiet dignity before, in soldiers who had done brave things but never talked about them. He could still remember his early years in uniform, the old sergeants who had seen combat and carried invisible scars. They never bragged, never boasted. They just did their duty and hoped to go home. The general turned slightly in his seat and glanced toward the back. He could just barely see the top of the veteran's head over the seats. He pressed the call button above his head. A few seconds later, a flight attendant appeared, smiling. "Can I get you something, sir?" she asked. Roth looked up and said, "Actually, I was wondering if you could tell me something. That elderly gentleman who boarded a few minutes ago, the one with the silver star pin, do you have his name?" The attendant hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was allowed to share passenger names, even with someone as important-looking as him. But something in the general's tone told her this wasn't an ordinary question. "I think his name is Mr. Delaney. Arthur Delaney." The name hit the general like a bolt of lightning. Yes, that was it. He remembered it now. Lieutenant Arthur Delaney. He had read about him years ago in a military archive during his time at the War College. Delaney had served in Vietnam. One of the most harrowing accounts in the entire archive. A jungle ambush, an entire platoon trapped, and one man who refused to leave until his men were safe. Delaney had taken a bullet to the leg and still held the line for over an hour. He saved more than a dozen lives that day. General Roth had admired that story ever since. He had even mentioned it once during a leadership seminar, but he never expected to see that man in real life, let alone sitting quietly in economy class on a commercial flight, as if he were just another old traveler, returning home. "Thank you," he said softly. The flight attendant nodded and walked away. Roth leaned back in his seat, but he didn't relax. His eyes were fixed forward, but his mind was racing. Something about what he had just seen didn't sit right with him. It wasn't about luxury or comfort. It wasn't about military ranks or titles. It was about respect, about honor, about how easily people forget the sacrifices that allow them to live freely. He looked around the first-class cabin. There were a few business executives typing on laptops, a woman in a designer dress sipping orange juice, and a young tech worker already fast asleep with earbuds in. No one seemed to have noticed Delaney. No one had stood up, offered a seat, or even asked about the silver star. The general's jaw tightened. He had commanded thousands of soldiers. He had visited military hospitals, spoken to grieving families, and stood at grave sites with folded flags in his hands. And here was a man who had bled for his country, being pushed to the back of a plane like he didn't matter. He made a decision. Unclipping his seatbelt, General Roth stood up. He walked toward the flight attendant again and asked, "Can you get the lead flight crew for me? I need to speak with the pilot or the airline supervisor." The attendant looked surprised. "Is everything all right, General?" "I'm not making a complaint," Roth replied calmly. "I just need to speak with someone in charge. It's important." The attendant nodded and stepped away quickly, sensing this was serious. A few minutes later, as other passengers continued boarding, the airline's operations supervisor, a woman named Karen, approached Roth near the front of the cabin. She was polite, professional, and a little nervous. It wasn't every day that a four-star general requested a meeting before takeoff. "Sir, I'm Karen Dorsey. "How can I assist you?" Roth nodded. "Thank you for coming. I'll get right to the point. One of your passengers, a Mr. Arthur Delaney, is a decorated war hero. He's a Silver Star recipient from Vietnam. Somehow he was bumped from first class to economy. I understand how overbookings work, but this is not just any passenger. I believe we have an obligation to do better." Karen listened carefully. "Sir, I truly appreciate what you're saying, but we've already closed the cabin and assigned all seats. We're fully booked in first class." Roth looked her in the eyes. "Then open it again." She hesitated. "Sir, I don't mean to sound difficult, but airline policy doesn't allow reassignments after the manifest is finalized unless it's a medical emergency or a safety issue." The general stepped a little closer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash his rank. He simply said, "This is an issue of dignity. That man out there risked his life for this country. He didn't ask for anything special. He didn't demand it. But I am asking you now, as someone who still wears this uniform, to find a way. I'm not asking for an upgrade for myself. I'm asking that you recognize him." Karen felt the weight of his words. She looked around the cabin, her thoughts racing. The delay would upset some passengers. There would be complaints. But deep down, she knew Roth was right. "I'll see what I can do," she said finally. The general nodded. "Thank you." While Karen spoke to her team on the ground, the general returned to his seat. He looked toward the back of the plane, again trying to catch sight of Delaney. From where he sat, he could see the man's profile. Quiet, still, eyes closed. He wondered what Delaney was thinking. Maybe he was remembering old friends. Maybe he was just tired. Or maybe he was used to being forgotten. 10 minutes passed. The plane was still at the gate. Some passengers began whispering, wondering about the delay. An announcement came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a slight delay due to a seating issue. Thank you for your patience." At the back of the plane, Art Delaney opened his eyes. He looked around, confused. People were checking their watches and groaning. But Art just sat quietly, not knowing that the delay had anything to do with him. A flight attendant approached his row and leaned in. "Mr. Delaney?" He looked up. "Yes?" "Would you mind coming with me, please?" He was surprised. "Is something wrong?" "No, sir. We just need you to come with us." He stood slowly, holding on to the seat in front of him for balance. Other passengers looked on, puzzled. Some assumed he had a medical issue. One man muttered something about missing his connection. As Delaney followed the attendant to the front, he saw General Roth standing near the cockpit. The two men locked eyes. Delaney recognized the uniform, the ribbons, the stars on the shoulder. He felt a strange mix of confusion and honor. He stopped walking, unsure. General Roth stepped forward, extended his hand, and said, "Lieutenant Arthur Delaney, I've read about you. I know what you did in Vietnam. You deserve this seat more than I do." Delaney shook his head, speechless. I don't understand." Roth smiled gently. "I believe we've forgotten how to thank people like you. Let me help correct that." The airline staff had rearranged the seating at Roth's request. A couple from first class had agreed to move to business class, and 2 business passengers were given economy vouchers. It wasn't an easy fix, but it had been done, with respect. Delaney was guided into a front-row seat. He sat down slowly, stunned. For a moment, he didn't know where to put his hands. He looked at the seat, the extra space, the warm cloth the flight attendant offered. He looked back at Roth, who was now seated beside him. "You didn't have to do this," Delaney said softly. "I know," Roth replied. "But someone had to." And just like that, the door closed. The plane pushed back from the gate. But something had changed in that cabin. Something that couldn't be measured by ticket class or frequent flyer miles. It was a quiet reminder that sometimes the people who have given the most ask for the least, and every once in a while, someone notices. The engines of the plane began to roar softly as it taxied toward the runway. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the seatbelt sign glowed above everyone's head. Most passengers were now quietly waiting for takeoff, some leaning back with their eyes closed, others scrolling through their phones one last time before airplane mode cut them off from the world. But in seat 2A, something very different was happening. Arthur Delaney sat upright, almost stiffly, still unsure whether this was really happening. He felt out of place, like a child wearing his father's oversized shoes. The first-class seat beneath him was wide and soft, far too comfortable compared to what he was used to. The tray table folded out like a quiet luxury. The flight attendant had even offered him a glass of water with a slice of lemon and a warm towel, which confused him more than anything else. Beside him, General Roth sat silently, watching him with a kind of quiet respect. He didn't say anything right away. He didn't want to overwhelm the old man or make him feel like he was under some spotlight. The gesture had been done. Now was the time to let dignity settle in on its own. But Arthur was still full of questions. He finally turned his head. His voice low but clear. "General, why'd you do this for me?" Roth looked at him, smiled faintly, and replied, "Because I've read about you, sir. I've studied men like you all my life. You may not remember it, but what you did in 1969 near the Songchang River, it mattered. And I wasn't about to sit here in comfort while the man who saved lives in the mud and fire of Vietnam was stuck near the engine noise and a broken seat tray." Arthur blinked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That was a long time ago." "I know," Roth said, "but some things don't expire." Arthur looked down at his hands. They were old now, spotted with age, thin and dry. But once, those same hands had held a rifle, dragged a wounded comrade through the jungle, applied pressure to bleeding wounds, and written letters to a mother whose son didn't make it back. He never talked much about the war, not even to his wife before she passed, not to his children. It was something he kept locked away. He'd left it all behind when he returned home. Got a job fixing cars, lived a quiet life. Just being back on American soil had felt like enough. He didn't need parades or medals. He didn't even pick up the Silver Star until 6 years after. The war ended. It had arrived in the mail, quietly, with no ceremony. But now, for the first time in decades, he felt like someone remembered. "I didn't think anyone even knew who I was anymore," Arthur whispered. "I did," Roth said. The plane lifted gently into the sky. Below them, the city shrank into little lights. The world felt far away now. High up in the clouds, the noise and chaos of daily life seemed to fade. There was a certain kind of peace in the air, and for Arthur, that feeling was rare. Roth shifted in his seat and asked, "Do you mind if I ask you something personal?" Arthur nodded. "Go ahead. Do you ever think about it? The war?" Arthur took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "Not if I can help it. But sometimes it still comes back, doesn't it?" Arthur nodded again. "Every night when I try to sleep." Roth leaned back. He understood. He had never fought in Vietnam, but he had commanded troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. He had seen men crumble under memories they couldn't run from. Sometimes the worst scars weren't on the body. They were hidden in the silence of a man's mind. Arthur continued, "You try to live a normal life. You try to forget the smell of burning jungle, the sound of screaming, but it never really goes away. It just hides better in the daytime." There was a moment of silence between them. It wasn't awkward, it was respectful, like two soldiers who didn't need to explain everything because they already understood. "I lost some good men that day," Arthur said quietly. "Sometimes I close my eyes and I still see their faces." Roth nodded. "That's because you were a leader, and a good one." Arthur looked at him, surprised. How would you know that? Because you stayed, Roth replied. Most men would have run when the firing started. You stayed until the last wounded soldier was airlifted out. That's leadership. Arthur didn't know what to say. He had never seen himself that way. He always thought he was just doing his job, just trying to survive. He never once thought he was being brave. As the flight continued, the two men began to talk more. Slowly at first, then with a growing sense of ease. Roth told stories about the modern military, how things had changed, how some things had stayed the same. Arthur listened with interest, sometimes nodding, sometimes shaking his head in disbelief. I don't understand all the technology these days, Arthur chuckled. Back then, we had radios the size of toasters, and half the time, they didn't even work. You'd be shocked what we carry now, Roth smiled. Drones, satellite gear, real-time battlefield data. But despite all that, it still comes down to courage. And heart. Arthur looked out the window. The sky was dark now, but stars were beginning to appear. I don't know if I had courage. I was scared every minute I was there. That's exactly what courage is, Roth said. Being scared and still doing the right thing. That sentence hit Arthur in a way he hadn't expected. All his life, he had carried guilt. Guilt for surviving. Guilt for not doing more. Guilt for coming home when others didn't. But now, here was a man, someone at the very top of the military, telling him that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing your duty in spite of fear. Arthur closed his eyes and nodded. Maybe you're right. A short while later, the flight attendant came by with meals. First class got actual food. Chicken, rice, vegetables, a soft roll with butter. Arthur stared at the plate, smiling. It's not sea rations, that's for sure. Roth laughed. Try the roll. It's the best part. As they ate, Arthur opened up more. He talked about the friends he'd lost, the letter he had to write to a mother in Idaho, the smell of rice paddies and gunpowder. Roth listened with full attention, not just out of respect, but because he genuinely wanted to hear every word. This wasn't just a war story. It was history, living history, spoken from the lips of someone who had been there. Then the conversation took a turn. Arthur asked, "Do you think people still care? About veterans, I mean," Roth thought for a moment. "Some do, some forget. That's the truth. We've gotten so used to peace that we forget the cost." Arthur nodded. "That's what I'm afraid of. That one day people won't even know what the Silver Star is." "They will," Roth said firmly. "As long as people like you are still here to remind us." Arthur looked away, his eyes glassy. "I won't be here forever, General." "No one will," Roth replied. "But stories like yours live longer than you think." After dinner, the cabin lights dimmed. Most passengers began to drift off to sleep. But Arthur and Roth remained awake, still talking in low voices. Roth asked about Arthur's life after the war, his job at the garage, his wife Clara, their 42 years of marriage, her passing 5 years ago. "She always waited for me," Arthur said, "even when I was gone 2 years straight. Wrote to me every week. Her letters kept me sane." Roth smiled. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. The plane flew on through the night, cutting across time zones and clouds. At some point, Arthur leaned back in his seat, resting his head on the cushioned headrest. He wasn't used to luxury, but he allowed himself this moment. The kindness he had received today, the seat, the conversation, the recognition, had touched him in a way he hadn't expected. Beside him, Roth finally closed his eyes too, but not before glancing one last time at the silver star pin on Arthur's chest. It glinted faintly under the cabin light. Small, but mighty, like the man who wore it. They didn't speak again for a while. There was no need. In that silence, there was something powerful, something deeper than any words could express. It was the connection between two soldiers, 2 generations, who had walked different paths but carried the same honor. And as the hours passed and the plane moved steadily westward, General Roth made a quiet promise to himself that he would make sure others heard Arthur's story, that he would tell young cadets about the lieutenant who stayed behind while bullets flew, that he would make sure the Silver Star meant something to people beyond a medal in a box. Because this wasn't just about one man's seat on a plane. It was about remembering what matters, and that Arthur Delaney had reminded him of. The flight moved steadily through the night sky, far above the patchwork of cities and forests below. Outside the window, the stars flickered like distant fires, reminding Arthur Delaney of nights long ago, when he was a young soldier hiding in the jungle, listening to the sounds of war. The soft hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin, a gentle background noise that contrasted sharply with the memories that swirled in his mind. Arthur was still adjusting to his new seat in first class. The wide space, the quiet atmosphere, the way the flight attendants treated him, everything felt strange but comforting at the same time. He looked over at General Marcus Roth, who sat beside him with a calm, steady presence. The general's quiet strength had helped ease some of the tension Arthur didn't even realize he was carrying. Arthur thought about the moment when he had first learned that he'd been moved from economy to first class. It had been unexpected, and to be honest, a little overwhelming. For years he had been content to sit quietly, blending in with the crowd, keeping his past locked away. But now, sitting here in this plush seat, surrounded by people who probably didn't know what the Silver Star really meant, he felt the weight of his service in a new way. General Roth had told him stories about modern soldiers, about wars fought with drones and computers, about the new challenges the military faced. But Arthur's thoughts kept drifting back to the past. The past that shaped him, and many others like him. He remembered the day the ambush happened. The sky was gray and heavy with rain. The thick jungle made every movement difficult, every breath labored. They were on patrol, a small platoon moving through the dense foliage, when the enemy attacked. Gunfire erupted like thunder all around them. The air filled with the sound of bullets tearing through leaves, the cries of men calling for help, and the heavy pounding of his own heart. Arthur's training kicked in. He took cover behind a fallen tree, returned fire, and shouted orders to keep his men together. But it wasn't enough. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from support. He looked around and saw some of his comrades wounded, others pinned down and unable to move. Despite the pain in his leg from a bullet wound, Arthur refused to leave them behind. He pulled out his radio and called for a medevac, holding the line until help arrived. For hours he fought off the attackers, shielding his friends, even as the jungle seemed to close in. When the helicopters finally landed, Arthur was exhausted, bleeding, but still standing. His platoon had survived because of his actions. It was a moment of both pride and sorrow. Pride for having saved lives, sorrow for those who did not make it. That story had been told many times in military circles, but Arthur had never talked about it much himself. It was too painful. He didn't want to be seen as a hero. He just wanted to be a man who did his duty. Now, sitting on this plane with General Roth beside him, those memories felt less like a burden and more like a part of his identity. Roth broke the silence. "You know, Arthur, not many people get to hear stories like yours, and fewer still get to sit in the same seat as you now." Arthur smiled softly. "I'm not used to attention." "You shouldn't be," Roth replied, "but you deserve it." The general's words were sincere. Arthur felt a warmth in his chest, a feeling that he hadn't experienced in years. For a moment, the loneliness that had followed him since returning home seemed to lift. As the flight progressed, the conversation turned to the struggles many veterans face after returning from war. Arthur shared how hard it had been to adjust to civilian life. The noise, the crowds, the quiet judgment of people who didn't understand what it was like to carry the scars of battle. He told Roth about the jobs he took, fixing cars in a small garage, working with his hands to build a life far away from the memories that haunted him. He talked about the nights when sleep wouldn't come, when nightmares dragged him back to the jungle, and the days when he felt invisible to the world. General Roth listened carefully. He had seen this pattern too many times. Brave men and women coming home, only to face a new kind of battle, a battle for respect, understanding, and peace. "I've seen many veterans fall through the cracks," Roth said quietly. "It's one of the hardest parts of my job, knowing we send soldiers into harm's way, but sometimes forget to help them come back." Arthur nodded. "It's like the war never really ends." "No, it doesn't," Roth agreed. "But that's why people like you matter. You remind us that the price of freedom isn't just paid on the battlefield, but also in the years that follow." Arthur looked out the window again. The city lights far below like tiny sparks of hope. "Sometimes, I wonder if I did enough." "You did," Roth said firmly. "More than most." The general then told Arthur about some of the programs being developed to help veterans: mental health support, job training, community centers. He spoke with passion and hope, his experience as a leader giving weight to his words. "It's not perfect," Roth admitted, "but we're trying. And stories like yours help us understand what needs to be done." Arthur felt a spark of hope ignite within him. Maybe his story could make a difference after all. Maybe the sacrifices he and his comrades made would not be forgotten. As the night wore on, the two men found a rhythm in their conversation, sharing stories, listening, and learning from each other. Arthur talked about his wife Clara, how she had been his rock through all the years, and how losing her had left a hole in his heart. Roth shared stories of his own family, the challenges of balancing military life with personal responsibilities, and the importance of connection. The flight attendants moved quietly around the cabin, offering drinks and snacks, careful not to disturb the two men deep in conversation. At one point, Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver star medal. He turned it over in his hand, the weight of it a reminder of both pain and pride. "Do you still carry it with you?" Roth asked. "Always," Arthur replied. "It's not just a medal, it's a memory, a promise to never forget." The general nodded, understanding. "And a reminder for the rest of us to honor those who carry it." As dawn approached, the sky outside began to lighten with soft shades of pink and orange. The plane continued its steady course toward San Diego. Arthur felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The kindness of the general, the recognition of his service, the chance to share his story, it had all given him a new sense of purpose. When the captain finally announced the plane's descent, Arthur and Roth exchanged a look of quiet understanding. This journey was more than just a flight. It was a moment of connection between two men from different generations, united by honor, sacrifice, and the hope that their stories would inspire others. And as the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, Arthur knew that, at least for today, he had been seen, not just as a passenger in economy or first class, but as a hero who had earned every bit of respect. The plane began its final descent, the wheels touching down on the runway with a gentle thud that sent a small ripple through the cabin. Outside, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the tarmac and the buildings of the airport. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was calm but filled with a quiet electricity, as if something important had just taken place during the flight. Arthur Delaney sat back in his seat, the Silver Star Medal resting gently in his palm, a small but powerful reminder of the life he had lived. For years, Arthur had carried his memories in silence. He had never sought attention or recognition for the sacrifices he made during the war. To him, he was just a man who did what needed to be done. But this journey had changed something inside him. The kindness shown by General Roth, the conversations they shared, and the acknowledgement of his service had stirred feelings of pride, hope, and a desire to be heard. As the plane came to a stop at the gate, Arthur gathered his belongings slowly. The flight attendant smiled warmly at him, a subtle but genuine gesture of respect that touched him deeply. He stood up carefully, his body aching slightly from the long flight and the years of wear and tear from his time in service and life after. General Roth stood beside him, steady and composed, ready to step off the plane with the same quiet dignity that had marked their entire journey together. They walked down the aisle side by side, two men connected by stories of courage and sacrifice, now bound by a shared understanding of the price of freedom. As they reached the exit, a small group of airport staff and passengers watched quietly. Some had noticed the unusual attention given to the man in first class, the veteran with the Silver Star Medal, and the high-ranking general accompanying him. Whispers spread, questions about who this man was and why he was being honored in such a way. Outside the plane, the fresh morning air greeted them, carrying the sounds of the bustling airport, the hum of vehicles, announcements over the loudspeakers, and the footsteps of travelers beginning their day. Arthur took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, grounding him in the present after so many years lost in memory. General Roth turned to him and said softly, "Arthur, this is just the beginning. Your story deserves to be told, and I intend to make sure it is." Arthur looked at the general, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief in his eyes. "Thank you, General. I never expected any of this." "You earned it," Roth replied firmly. "And many others will too, once they hear your story." They moved toward the waiting area where a small press contingent had gathered. Reporters with cameras and microphones were ready to capture the moment. It was unexpected for Arthur, who had never been one for the spotlight. Yet, as he stood there, the weight of years of silence seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet resolve to share the truth of what he had lived. A reporter stepped forward, asking questions about the Silver Star and the incident that had earned Arthur the medal. Arthur answered simply, his voice steady but humble. He spoke about the men he fought. Beside, the friends he lost and the responsibility he felt to honor their memory. He spoke about the war not as a glorious adventure, but as a harsh reality that changed lives forever. His words resonated deeply with those listening. It was a reminder that behind every medal and every headline, there were real people with stories of courage, pain, and hope. In the days that followed, Arthur's story spread beyond the airport. Veterans organizations reached out, inviting him to speak at events and share his experiences with younger generations. Schools asked him to talk about history from a personal perspective, helping students understand the human cost of war. Arthur embraced this new role with humility and determination. He realized that by sharing his story, he could help others, veterans struggling with their own memories, families seeking to understand the sacrifices made, and communities learning to appreciate the true meaning of service. General Roth remained a steadfast supporter, working behind the scenes to connect Arthur with resources and platforms that amplified his voice. Together, they championed causes to improve veterans' health care, mental health services, and support networks. Their partnership became a symbol of hope and change, bridging the gap between generations and experiences. Arthur's life took on new meaning. The loneliness that had once shadowed his days began to fade, replaced by a sense of belonging and purpose. He found joy in connecting with fellow veterans, in mentoring young people, and in knowing that his sacrifices were not forgotten. Looking back, Arthur understood that the flight where he was moved to first class was more than just a simple gesture. It was a turning point, a moment when recognition, respect, and human kindness converged to remind him that his life mattered. As he stood on the stage at a veterans event months later, receiving a standing ovation, Arthur felt tears welling in his eyes, not from sorrow, but from a deep gratitude for the journey he had taken, for the people who had stood beside him, and for the chance to finally be heard. He looked out at the crowd, young and old, veterans and civilians alike, and spoke from his heart. He talked about bravery, sacrifice, and the importance of remembering. But most of all, he spoke about hope. Hope that every veteran would find the support and respect they deserved, and that their stories would never be lost to time. In that moment, Arthur Delaney was no longer just a man who had been moved from economy to first class on a plane. He was a symbol of resilience, courage, and the enduring power of recognition, and the silver star on his chest shone brighter than ever.